I will not be too long. We're all at the end of a long and, frankly, at least for me, somewhat head-spinning day. I will just summarize a few of the things that caught my attention, both in terms of things that we talked about and also, in a few cases, things we didn't talk very much about. And sometimes those are at least as important, and maybe some of these are topics that we'll have an opportunity to return and get into tomorrow. So we opened the day with a little bit of a summary that harkened back to a workshop that I wasn't able to be here for yesterday, but really looked at standards frameworks for annotations. And at least as I understand it, builds heavily on the kind of thinking that went into the open annotation work that's formed a basis for some of the projects we've seen here. Now, there are a couple things that are really interesting about that. One is that the open annotation work, as we can see from what we saw today, has a lot of momentum and implementation behind it. Yet nobody seemed at all concerned about the fact that we could be talking about starting one of these endlessly protracted W3C standards efforts and what that might or might not do to the momentum that's already underway, about whether there should be some explicit assumption of backwards compatibility or continuity with the open annotation work or anything like that. That just seemed like an odd kind of gap that maybe was all handled in the workshop, but certainly set off at least a little uneasiness for me in terms of continuing, what now is really a significant amount of momentum after the scale of investments that have been made in all the open annotation work. There are a couple of other issues around what does it mean to have a standard for annotation. One which didn't come up really hardly at all, except by implication until one of the breakouts in the afternoon, was how it relates to identity, and in particular some of the emergent identifier systems, some of the work in federated identity, what kind of levels of assurance need to be implicit in the connection between identity management and annotation, and I think that bears a good deal more examination. At the same time, we were quickly reminded in the presentations this morning particularly that there was a whole emerging set of practices about what I'd characterize as the social structure of management and moderation of annotations. And this builds a bit on work that has gone on in other quarters on the management and moderation of various kinds of conversational forums. But we saw that, for example, very strongly in the discussions around Rap Genius. How to scale some of this up across lots of annotation systems and communities. Very interesting question. Some other things that were touched on, the relationship between annotation and web archiving. Very provocative issue that has not received a lot of exploration. Now, after those kinds of very concrete things, there's something else that started to emerge. One was we have this kind of very specific conversation about how we annotate things that are visible to the web. And that, of course, is the underpinning of a lot of the open annotation work and would naturally be a kind of a scoping parameter for any work out of W3C, I would expect. And we get into this messy kind of juncture where we want to be able to talk about substructures where only the main structure is available on the, is known and visible through the web. You get some kind of a video thing, and really typically the web just knows about, here's a continuous piece of medium. It doesn't get into a lot of detail about how that's structured, so you have these kind of messy hooks that go into different data types to allow you to address in. Yet a lot of the really interesting cases seem to be about objects that aren't very visible on the web or are visible only at very aggregate levels. So we heard a lot of interest in annotating time-driven media, music, audio, video. Several groups touched on various issues that I'll come back to about things like scientific data sets and the notion of annotating those in some fashion. Even heard some bits of conversation about, well, what would it mean to annotate World of Warcraft or a video game? Something that, is really as much a collaborative software object as anything else, and that really has almost no comprehensible web presence other than as a link that drops you into an entirely different environment. So you have this kind of funny disconnect about the scope of the work that different people are doing here and what kinds of solutions are likely to be helpful in those different spheres. One of the really interesting set of discussions that I had not given much thought to before this day is the interconnects between social media and annotation. And it was kind of fun because we went down a slippery slope that started with, well, I can expose my annotations into social media to drive more interest to the annotations of the underlying objects. And then on we went into the idea that social media itself can be a form of annotation. There's a way of thinking about annotation as a way to capture conversation. And that's the same thing that social media sort of does. So I think that I think that there's a complicated area there where we don't understand the boundaries, or the best approaches perhaps would be a more helpful characterization than the boundaries. There's a certain sense in which you can do the same thing using a half a dozen different kinds of tools and intellectual approaches. And one of the things I heard a bit of here is, well, you can do almost anything with annotation if you put your mind to it. I think we really would be well served by some conversations about when is annotation, to the extent that we can agree on what it is, and you heard some unease about that in some of the group reports. When is that really kind of the right architectural approach, and when is something else the right architectural approach? How much do we really, for example, want to encapsulate conversation in annotation systems? That is really not clear to me, other than this sort of general notion that interminable linked conversations attached to objects may not be the best parking place for those conversations if you're trying to understand the underlying object. Maybe we want some looser degree of linking than at least I think about annotation. At the other extreme, we've seen some applications of annotation kinds of approaches to things that really are fundamentally multi-layered documents. For example, translations or transcriptions attached to underlying manuscript images, things like that. And you can do that with an annotation model. You can do that with some other things too. It would be very, very helpful to get a good reading on whether annotation is the right way to think about these fundamentally multi-layered documents, or whether we should be thinking about attaching annotation to some other kind of data structure that is the multi-layered document. I don't know what the right answer is there, but it kind of shows you the breadth of uses to which the annotation kind of approach can be taken without giving us much guidance on whether it's always the right hammer to attack everything with. Another very interesting question, I think, is the relationship between annotation and metadata. A lot of objects have metadata associated with them, and to what extent is annotating the object simply updating the metadata? To what extent is it something else? Is it just that the annotation implies that the addition to the metadata was not necessarily made in a way that was complicit with the creators of the original metadata? Or is there something else going on there? And what does that mean, again, for the kind of archiving and ongoing curation of these objects? One of the very interesting phenomenon we've seen is cultural heritage institutions putting up collections of data on various platforms and inviting people to comment or annotate on them. And then after this has been going on for a while, the curatorial folks who are charged with maintaining these collections for over long periods of time start thinking, well, what do we do with these comments? Do we fold them into the metadata that we're associating with these objects for the long haul and the kind of permanent record, or are they a sort of a transient artifact of the platform that we put it out on for the, to reach a community in a given period of time, and they go away after that. So I think there's some things in that area that are worth thinking about. The last thing I just want to comment on briefly is the relationship between annotation and workflow. It feels to me like a lot of the discussion about annotation, and it's a natural mental model, is document-based in some sense. You've got some permanent thing, whether it's time-based media or a web page or a document, and you're attaching annotations to it. And the sort of presentation tools for those documents are relatively implicit. If you think about issues like documenting data, scientific data, or games or something like that, really often what you're trying to do with annotations is not speak so much to the underlying data, but the data in conjunction with some kind of workflow, a visualization or an analysis or something, where you're trying to figure out how to note, look here, when you view this data in this kind of context or from this perspective, there's something interesting or anomalous going on. But it may be very hard to say that in terms of the underlying data rather than in terms of some kind of analysis or visualization workflow. So I think we're going to need to start, for certain kinds of usage scenarios, thinking about how we capture that kind of workflow context rather than just talking about the underlying data. So those are a few of the reflections that I have on things I've heard. One of the things that I will say is that I think that people in a lot of different sectors of scholarship are starting to realize that there is a lot of power in being able to annotate and connect across the literature of the discipline, beyond the kind of silos that publishers induce through paywalls and things like that. And I think that's starting to be perceived as perhaps something that's well within reach of current kinds of technology and platforms. And I think there's a good deal of interest starting to emerge from those kinds of use cases. So those are just a few things to think about. I do want to close on the disclaimer that there were lots of breakout groups. I sat in one for the first round of breakouts and thought about what I was going to say here for most of the second round. So there's plenty I missed, and take anything where I said I didn't hear much about with a grain of salt, because I may just not have been in the right place to be listening. But I hope that some of these observations are helpful in moving the conversation forward tomorrow.